Welcome to my exhibition. It's called One for the Road. It's an exhibition encompassing some aspects of the era of coaching and of the Regency period. The Regency period was from 1811 to 1820, and coupled with the great era of coaching, which was 1780 to 1840, these were very interesting times. They were intertwined with wars, uprising, frost fairs, gold coaches, satire, caricature, and the building of the Brighton Pavilion. The development of road improvements too, which was paid for by the turnpike system, was another incredibly important part of the Regency period and of the coaching era, because without the improvement to the roads, the coaches wouldn't have been able to travel at the speeds they were able to travel at. This was all paid for by a turnpike system. There was also, during this period, the establishing of the Bow Street runners. Sir John Fielding and his brother realised that with the lawlessness that they were faced with, they would have to do something about curtailing the street robberies, and the highwaymen pretty much were coming to an end, but lawlessness and street robbery was rife. And so Sir John Fielding and his brother they established the Bow Street Runners, which became the forerunner of the Metropolitan Police. It took a long time and there were lots of changes, but in a kind of word, that's what happened. It was also a time of great charm, of great beauty, of enormous poverty. And there was a real struggle during this period to move into the world of commerce and the Industrial Revolution, which had already started, but which was beginning to really take its grip on the minds of the people of England. We could talk here a little bit about slavery, because the anti-slavery became an act in 1807. But as we all know, slavery continued really until the late 1860s. And isn't slavery with us today still, as Mo Farah admitted on the news the other night? Really, slavery is still with us. It was a time too of heroes. The Duke of Wellington, Sir John Moore, Colindale, Nelson, these wonderful men rose up to help defeat Napoleon. And if it hadn't been for these incredible men, I rather suspect that the rest of us would all be singing the Marseillaise and we'd all be French, because Napoleon was rather a force of his own. It was also a rather interesting period, because with the beginning of the expansion of the British Empire, the expansion of the East India ships going to India, and then the setting up of plantations in Jamaica and in the West Indies, enormous wealth was also coming to Great Britain from tobacco and cotton and sugar, particularly sugar, of course. Sugar was the next best thing. And one of the people who had a fortune left to him from the sugar plantations was a chap called William Beckford. And William Beckford lived in Wiltshire, and he had the equivalent of £1 million a year just to spend on himself. And he really did spend a lot of money. He travelled a lot, and he did the Grand Tour, and he went to Europe. And when we think about the Grand Tour, we probably don't realise that in order to go on a Grand Tour, you had to have a passport, which you picked up in Paris. And in my exhibition is a wonderful example of a European Grand Tour passport that was owned by a young man called Joseph Godman. And Joseph Godman, whose father was a brewer, had an awful lot of money as a young man, so he decided to do the Grand Tour. And this passport came to my notice through a lecturer of mine at Camberwell called John Collins. John is now dead, but his wife has agreed to loan me this extraordinary document, which is huge. It's very long and it's double-sided. And it shows you that every single town Joseph Godman went to, he had to get it stamped by the local magistrate. So There's nothing new about passports. Anyway, William Beckford too did this amazing journey. And he would have travelled all the way through Germany and France and down to Italy. And he wrote these wonderful journals about his travels. And they are probably one of the most amazing things he left behind. He did also build an enormous edifice called Fonthill Abbey, and that was huge. It was the most enormous building, and it had a huge tower, which was 272 feet high. And he ended up selling this building, which had cost him millions to build. He sold it for £30,000, and the tower actually did fall down. So what an enormous waste of money. Very sad. But getting back to our friend Mr. Godman, whose father was a brewer, his father had 2 partners in his brewing company, and one was called Martigneau, and the other one was called Whitbread. And they decided to call the company Whitbreads. So that company is with us today, and that passport is the passport of the son of the man who established Whitbread's brewery. Poverty. 18th century poverty was pretty grim. But the 18th century was also a very interesting period in which the rich mixed very much with the poor. There were lots of brothels, and there was great poverty in the brothels. And when women died in childbirth or just after or during pregnancy, they were literally thrown into communal graves. And there is a very large one at St Matthew's Church up in Bethnal Green, and they reckon they've got 80,000 bodies in there. It was a tough time to be a woman, because women had no rights. They had no money. If they did have money, as soon as they married, it became their husbands. So women were pretty poorly off. But one of the most interesting women that I bumped into in my researches was Lady Letitia, Lady Lade. And she was enormously entertaining. She doesn't really know who her parents were, but she became a cook. And she had a bit of a liaison with a highwayman called 16-String Jack, who was also rather a character. And 16-String Jack and Lady Letitia Lade obviously had quite a lot of fun, and they would have mixed up at the Vauxhall Gardens. They would have had a lot of fun up there. But it turns out that Lady Letitia Lade was also the mistress of the Duke of York. So she must have been moving in some quite interesting circles. Anyway, when 16-String Jack was finally caught and hung, she was weeping at his gallows, weeping at Tyburn. And she was noticed by Sir John Lade. And because obviously she was just Letitia Smith, we think, at this time, but she was noticed by Sir John Lade. And she was 6'2" and blonde and very beautiful, so I'm not surprised he noticed her. And he went up to her and obviously offered her some compassionate, some compassion. And they fell in love and they got married. And Sir John Lade knew the Prince of Wales very well, the Prince Regent, and they used to have a lot of fun hunting in Surrey, and she had a hell of a life with Sir John Lade. It must have been tremendous fun. And Stubbs painted her. There was this, the Prince Regent paid Stubbs to produce this beautiful portrait of her in her green gown. Now, she died in 1825, but at the back of the front of my exhibition, there is a beautiful gown, which is a copy of a French side saddle habit. And it's very like the one that Lady Letitia, Lady Lade, was riding in the day that she was painted by Stubbs. And I have in fact ridden in that gown. There was a lot more to the Regency period and to the coaching period than just the last of the highwaymen. There was also caricature and satire. And there were people like Gilray and Thomas Rowlandson and John Kay and Johnny Leach. And these people were very powerful artists who satirized society, along with Sheridan, the writer who wrote plays, but they satirized that's the society of that period. And apparently the Prince Regent used to rush round the print shops to try and buy up all the prints that showed him to be quite dreadful and awful and eating too much and fornicating too much. I gathered that he was quite nervous about it. But there were no laws to stop anybody doing that. Although it was more difficult for Thomas Paine because people were put in prison for selling his leaflets. Thomas Paine was another of the great writers of the day, with The Rights of Man and The Age of Reason and Common Sense. So during this period of the Regency and the coaching era, we had terrible uprisings like the Gordon Riots and the Peterloo Riots later on in 1918. But we also had the American War of Independence and then the French Revolution, the Jacobins and the French Revolution. And then after that, we had the Napoleonic Wars. These were tough times to go through, and they were tough times for agriculture as well. And one of the wonderful champions of agriculture was William Cobbett, and he is also mentioned in this exhibition. He was born in Farnham, and he was a self-trained agriculturalist. He read books, and he worked the land, and he travelled all over England, looking to see how people were coping with agriculture and what the different soils rendered up. And he became an advisor to Parliament. He wrote a lot of very interesting pamphlets. The coaching era, my goodness. The coaching era really sort of got underway by about 1780. And with the improvement of the roads, thanks to Metcalfe and Macadam and Telford, we had better coaches and then better communications between towns, and the beginning also of the Royal Mail. And one of these coachmen was a chap called Thomas Cross, and he wrote a wonderful autobiography. And it is astonishing because he talks in great detail about his life driving coaches all over England. It's mentioned in this exhibition. We also have a beautiful set of prints here up on the wall talking about a trip from London to Epsom and back. And it gives you some idea of what the streets would have been like and the carriages would have been like and the sort of things you would have met on the way. There's also some beautiful prints here about showing the road to Brighton. And you took your life into your hands when you got into a stagecoach, because if a wheel went into a very deep rut, the stagecoach would turn over. And if the stagecoach turned over, my goodness, people were very seriously injured. And I'm afraid in those days, if you had a broken leg or a serious injury, you probably died of sepsis or gangrene. Not very exciting. They didn't have the NHS that we have today. Well, they didn't have any kind of NHS. The other thing that this whole period was very, very important for was entertaining. There were the clubs in London, 20,000 of them, where all these young men used to go. There were gambling clubs and pugilistic clubs and horse racing clubs. And there was also this wonderful gravestone, which I found in Stockbridge. Well, it's not the original one, although it looks very like it. But no, I didn't steal it from the graveyard. It's a gravestone to John Bucket. And John Bucket was the landlord of the King's Head in Stockbridge. And he was such a wonderful landlord and so well loved by everyone in Stockbridge that they gave him this wonderful gravestone with this incredible poem on it about John Bucket. And it's truly, I think, one of my best finds on my travelling through Wiltshire and my general research. And I've known about John Bucket for many years, but it is worth coming and reading this extraordinary poem about a wonderful man. It was, the Regency and the coaching era was a time of fine manners, of debauchery, of excesses, of wonderful comic theatre, of great writers like Gibbon, Sheridan, Swift, Defoe, Molière, John Locke, composers as well, such as Mozart, Mayer, Bach, and so on. The coaching era and its flowering during the Regency period magnified life to its ultimate polarities. Thank you.